This topic is on dual relationships. Again, in the beginning of this is the ethical standards, and you can read that on your own. You don't need me to read those to you. Why did I pick this as a hot topic? So I did a lot of research, and this is actually one of the most common ethical violations that therapists are sanctioned for. The first one is not taking all your CEU courses, but the second is dual relationships, and the third is unprofessional conduct. And I have more on that, but most of the dual relationships, the most common ethical complaints are actually sexual misconduct with adult clients. And number 5 is with minor clients, and then non-sexual dual relationships. So how are we dealing with boundaries? We're going to talk a lot about crossing and violating them, or, we can also avoid boundaries. So what are some of our most common boundaries? So touch, could be hugging or any kind of touch in session. Our time, how we manage our time, whether we run over sessions time a lot. Self-disclosure, including disclosing information on political beliefs, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, or giving out personal phone number or home address. And again, I'm going to talk about crossings versus violation because, I know people will say to me, well, of course I would, disclose my sexual orientation. And that, for the most part, is going to be okay. Location, seeing patients outside of the office or at social events, and accepting and or giving gifts. So we're going to talk about crossings versus violations. What are some of the differences? Crossings are pretty much usually more ambiguous, while violations are fairly clear-cut. Crossings may mean your actions differ for a standard agency norm, when violations may harm the client, and generally the harm aspect is what makes something a violation. Crossings can be dependent on your relationship with the client, your cultural background, their cultural background, and crossings may be helpful to a client while violations never are. And again, that's when I use the example of disclosing your sexual orientation to a client. That's something that can often be helpful to a client. Some examples of boundary violations: any sexual contact with a client, any verbal or emotional aggression or abuse, financial transactions such as borrowing or lending money, any physical aggression, violating confidentiality, and any other sort of dual relationship. So what are you thinking about when you're thinking about, crossing a boundary and considering it? So your motivation for action. I think, walking through this and thinking about hugging a client is a great example. So what motivates you to think about hugging your client? How do you think that action will be perceived by the client? Because I've seen in my own practice that oftentimes things I say have been perceived differently than I intended from a client. Are there any cultural implications? Are the actions consistent with your theoretical orientation? Obviously, a lot of orientations would say no to hugging, and some would say it's okay. Is it consistent with many or what most therapists might do? And do you need to consult with somebody to make a decision? And if you do consult with somebody, you need to document that. What are some types of dual relationships that we could potentially engage with in the client? So a social one, and this could be a relationship where there's a friendship, and that could be in person or online. So that's where the social media stuff comes in, as far as not being friends with clients on Facebook or any other social media platform. A professional dual relationship. So when there's some sort of business relationship between the client and therapist, it could be a clinical supervisory one or an entirely different business. A sexual relationship that's pretty obvious, and financial, any sort of borrowing and lending, or other exchanges of money other than paying the fee. This is one of the reasons that CAFT recommends not letting clients accumulate balances as they feel like it can tip into a financial lending relationship. And community. And this is one that's common and harder to navigate. So you and the client both live in a small community and your lives might intersect at the kids' school or the place of worship or an AA meeting or an LGBT event. And those things, you just need to negotiate the spaces and document that you did so. Are all dual relationships unethical? No, they're not. I mean, it's complicated. Again, as I use the example with community, sometimes it's unavoidable. And, you just, again, have to negotiate the different spaces and how you're going to do that in a, professional manner. And have the discussions with the client. Don't just ignore the issue. Which ones are unethical? Any relationship that could cause harm to a client is considered unethical. So sexual client with a client or former client, or even in some ethics standards, people related to the client. Most ethics codes say that there's a 2-year limit, but proof of the burden of no harm for the former client is on you. So even if it's beyond 2 years, the proof of the burden that you're not harming the former client is still on you. So, 2 years is in the ethics codes, but I think most professionals advise just never doing it. Engaging in any sort of business relationship with a client. A close personal relationship, such as going on vacation together, borrowing money from a client. And in most circumstances, most boards are going to find the relationship is unethical. Although I do have an interesting example from the Board of Behavioral Sciences where they found a relationship unethical, but it went to an administrative law judge and they found it wasn't. So this case was brought against a therapist for gross negligence and reckless conduct that resulted in emotional harm to a client. And the allegations included that the therapist babysat for the client. The board's expert said all dual relationships are unethical. And then they clarified by saying dual relationships that cause harm are unethical. And they believe dual relationships always caused harm, which, as we've said previously, is, sort of a gray line. And the judge found that the ethical standards did not specifically forbid social interactions. And the defendant's expert testified that none of these practices were unethical and they were in furtherance of the therapeutic relationship. And the judge ruled with the therapists on the therapist's half. It found that they were a compassionate, caring individual and there was no actual intent to harm the patient. So it's an interesting case. I think most of us would say that babysitting for a client's child is unethical, but it shows the levels of complication. So I reviewed many of the BBS complaints using the Therapist magazine from 2009 to 2019. I reviewed 3 issues a year, randomly chosen, and only 9 of those issues were there no dual relationship issues. There was a total of 56 that I found. In 5 of those cases, sexual boundaries were crossed with an intern or supervisee. In 25 cases, there was sex with a patient or former patient. Some of those cases were criminal, such as sex with a minor patient. 8 of those cases, interestingly enough, were seen in couples therapy. I just found that interesting. And in 14 of those cases, there was other types of dual relationships, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this, because we think commonly of dual relationships as being sexual, and most of us understand that that's not okay. But in these dual relationship complaints, there was financial exploitation, 2 cases of therapists becoming power of attorneys for clients, an inappropriate relationship with minor clients that ended up with the therapist as a foster parent, letting a client stay at one's home or attending kids' games, having a mother-daughter dynamic, a therapist asking for donations for the kids' school, trying to influence patients' politics, have them use the job to help therapists, and having discussions about the therapist's sex life, beginning a social relationship very soon after therapy ended, and a business relationship also very soon, going to social events together, influencing the client to attend spiritual events when the therapist got compensated, self-disclosure about sex life and inconsistent practice and disclosure about fees, giving gifts and cards that say I love you, and attending the same AA meeting. And again, attending the same 12-step meeting without addressing the conflict. So that's one of the spaces where, again, you have to address the conflict. And in another case, a client started a cloud doc sharing their thoughts. The therapist responded with their own thoughts and poems, and then later asked to be compensated. And they were also very overly disclosing. So what did I learn from reading all of those complaints? Sexual boundaries were crossed after a whole bunch of boundaries were crossed first. You know, it often started with hugging, a lot of self-disclosure, and then social interactions, and then sex. For the most part, therapists understand it's wrong to sleep with the clients, and both clients and former clients. And, you know, one therapist did so after giving out the pamphlet, Psychotherapy Never Includes Sex, but did it anyway. Many times the therapist has their own issues going on, such as their own substance abuse or crises. It's really important to check in with yourself and another colleague if you are thinking about crossing a boundary. If you're reluctant to consult, that means it's a huge red flag. Talking about your own relationship or sex life with a client almost always leads to trouble. If you are considering this, please consult with a colleague. If you have a conflict with a client, such as a 12-step meeting, it must be discussed with them and then dealt with. And it is your responsibility to do that and document it. And terminating a therapy relationship to start a sexual relationship is both abandonment and a dual relationship. So what are some red flags that indicate you might be crossing or close to crossing a boundary? You're really looking forward to spending time with a client, or you instigate contact outside of session, phone, text, email. You seek to spend time with them outside of session. You start disclosing many details about your own life, particularly relationship or financial issues. You're not consistently holding boundaries with a client, such as late cancellation, running sessions over time. Again, that's one of those things where, you know, you can always cross it sometimes, but if you're consistently doing it, you need to look at why. You're taking credit for all the client's progress. You don't want to terminate with a client when it's clinically indicated. You're attempting to influence a client's personal views on religion or politics, and you have a resistance to discussing any red flags. So again, there's a bunch of references in the packet, a bunch of other articles I encourage you to take a look at. And I hope that this video and handout on dual relationships gives you an idea of how to make decisions on crossings and a better understanding of what a violation is and how to avoid it. Thanks for listening.